This video is a continuation from the previous video. So far we've talked in theory about aperture and shutter speed. And the third component that we're going to talk about is called ISO. It is pronounced ISO like that, ISO. It is actually an acronym and I never remember. It stands for International Organization for Standardization. It's just not a memorable name. And really what that generally means is that it's the brightness of your image that is determined by the number that you set for your sensor. Okay, this is the bottom of our triangle here, and ISO starts off at, I think the lowest ISO you can get is 32. When I was shooting slide film, we shot 50 in general, and that film was set for ISO. You didn't change that on your camera unless you wanted to push your film. Now on digital cameras, you set your ISO, and it usually starts at 100, and it can go up to 1280. Some can get even higher than that. I think mine goes up to 6400. I mean, no, sorry, that's not right. That's not higher than 128. That may be the highest mine goes. So, yeah, 64,000 maybe. I could be wrong. But so you just want to look at your camera and see what your range, your ISO range is. In general, it's something that you see. We saw that on the back of the camera. I didn't include the camera here. It's something you see, and then you set and under your eye. When you press your eye for your menu that comes up, you set your ISO there. Okay, so this is a very complex relationship between signal, which is the light, and noise, which is the interference, that impact the dynamic range, which is the image quality of the shoot. It's a lot of math. Just another way of saying there's math, and that math takes into consideration what is your lighting, right? We have 24 hours in a day in which the light changes from minute to minute. And then we have artificial lighting that we can create in different ways. And then we have something that's noise. Now, noise, which is interference, is dust particles, it's water vapor in the atmosphere, it's refraction of the light that's coming through based on surfaces that are in the area where you're shooting. I'm sure there are things I'm forgetting right now. And those that impact the quality of the image that's recorded. Okay, those are driving factors in your ISO. I will tell you, most people just automatically don't want to think about it and set it to the lowest possible setting, around 100, and leave it there. And they don't think about it. And in the beginning, that's fine. However, when you start shooting in lower light settings, and you will eventually, you're going to have to adjust your ISO. Now, some of the noise you can filter out in post-production. You can take it into Photoshop and Lightroom and get rid of a lot of the noise. But as we talk about in photography class, you want the image to be as pure as possible with as little editing needed as necessary, because it makes the photograph the higher quality. But it's not to say that you can't do this. So know that you can shoot. So if I'm inside shooting in a conference center, I might have to shoot ISO 800. And now, because of that sensitivity and the interference coming in, I may have some grain, which is the noise, in my photo that needs to be removed. Okay, so all things being equal, a higher ISO will do the following. It will increase the brightness of your image. Okay, so as you can see down here on the bottom, well, it's actually showing you that it's showing you darker, but literally here, follow the arrow. It increases the brightness. So if you shoot at 100, and then leave your aperture and shutter the same and just adjust your ISO, your image will get brighter. Okay. A higher ISO will decrease the total dynamic range of the image, which is its quality. And in many cases, like astrophotography, where you go out and shoot the stars, a higher ISO will actually decrease your noise. Okay. So that's why it's a complex relationship, because in some cases, when you're out shooting at night in the dark, when you set for the proper exposure, which you will have to do manually, it will actually decrease your noise. And I'll show you what that looks like in a minute. When working in low light settings where you cannot use a tripod, the ISO allows you to capture sharper images by hand, or brighter images by hand. And then you can use Photoshop and Lightroom to remove most of the noise. Okay, so here's an example. So say you're shooting aperture priority in low lighting and you adjust your ISO. And this is interesting. I just realized it did 160, 320, 640, and then it goes to 100. I guess they shot out of order. Okay, so let's just start with ISO 100, and you can see as we are shooting an aperture priority, the resulting noise is the color pixelization of the image. This is what begins to happen. So someone's out, let's say this person's out night, dark, no moon, and they're just shooting off into the darkness. And this is what begins to happen as you change the ISO. You begin to get these colored dots. And it's kind of pretty actually, but it's not, you don't want this in your image. Or you might. I'm actually going to show you some intentional film grain that makes a beautiful photo. Because, remember, for every rule, there's opportunity to break that rule to achieve art. Okay, so in these exposure modes, using a higher ISO will result in an image with more relative noise. And it means these. So if you're shooting in program, aperture priority, shutter priority on your camera, in general, the higher the ISO, the more noise you get. Okay. The way to get rid of the noise is going to be to use manual settings. And that is not a one-size-fits-all easy recipe. It involves math. However, a couple slides down, I will give you guys a link that someone else has already done the math that you can use to calculate what your manual settings need to be. And I haven't even shown you how to do that yet. We're going to get into that too. But we want to talk about what ISO is. And so ISO, most people consider it to be the sensitivity of the sensor, and it's not. That is not what it is at all. It's not its sensitivity. It is its ability to brighten the image, which sounds like sensitivity, but it's just not. So the increase in noise when using a higher ISO in these automatic settings is due to the reciprocity by decreasing the shutter time or decreasing the aperture as a result of using those automatic settings. So what's going to happen is you're going to want to end up using a wide aperture, and then you have to calculate to make sure your shutter speed is not too fast. So, and this is hard. It's hard for even me, and I know the math. So most people misattribute the increase in noise to ISO when it's actually caused by that lower signal to noise ratio due to the wrong shutter or aperture setting. Okay, so it's the ISO plus the wrong shutter or aperture that creates noise. And again, like anything, right? The best way to know your camera is just to get out in the dark and shoot, scrolling through, say, just go in and set your camera to manual and start making adjustments and taking shots and seeing what kind of noise you get. And you'll have the opportunity to do that. Okay, so when setting a higher ISO on one of the auto exposure modes, the camera tries to achieve a neutral exposure and compensates for the increase in ISO by decreasing the amount of light entering the camera. And that's what creates your noise, okay? So the camera automatically does this light reduction every time you shoot in one of those program modes, okay? So a reduction of light by the shutter or the aperture gets you the noise. So it's not noisier because of the higher ISO, it's noisier because of the camera attempting to compensate by reducing the light. Therefore, the signal yields an overall lower noise to light signal ratio and creates the noise. Yeah, that's complicated. Here's a photo taken at the piazza in Venice after the tide has receded or it stopped raining, I don't know which, in low light, and you can see there's no noise. And that is because this person shot in manual mode and the manual settings. Now you can start in, let's say we decided to start with aperture priority because we want to shoot f/16 because we wanted the whole piazza. We wanted everything in focus. So we start with f/16 and we focus on the basilica back here. This is St. Mark's Basilica. And we focus on this, f/16, and we can write down what the camera tells us the shutters should be. Okay, we can write that down. We can start with that. Then we can dial to manual, put those numbers in, take that shot, and now start to adjust the shutter speed. And we're going to get to this next, the exposure compensation to maintain the right exposure but get rid of our noise. Okay, very complicated stuff. But I needed you to know what it is. I need you to understand what it is, because if I don't tell you this, someone's going to tell you that ISO is sensitivity and a higher ISO noise means, a higher ISO number means no higher noise, and that is not actually true. For now, when you're working, most of the time when you'll be working in adequate light, and go ahead and work with a low ISO, 100, 200, 400. Just go ahead and work with those. If your shots are still getting that motion blur, you can bump up your ISO to 400, 800 even is you can take that out. But I wouldn't go above 800 right now, okay? So, yeah, I'm sorry. I know how crazy all this is when you're trying to learn it. I still remember, like, this was thrown at me first before I ever took any photos on my DSLR, and I was totally lost. So I know how complicated this is, but I just want to make sure that everybody understands that ISO is not sensitivity, and that increasing it does not automatically mean that you're going to get grain. It's just a byproduct of these priority modes, these setting modes on our camera, trying to compensate for that ISO and actually creating a mess. The good news is they're trying to fix that in newer models of cameras. So if you end up with a camera that's a newer version, it does have some adjustment for the ISO. But for those of us that have older cameras, we still have to work with this. Okay. So I'm going to stop this video here and continue in the next.